folks. How are you? Hey, taking pictures?
Yeah, we're shooting a movie.
What's that? Shooting a movie?
Videos, yeah.
Okay. Problem. Move over laws in Ontario. You familiar with them?
Yeah?
Yeah? Okay, did you see the cruiser back there?
What cruiser?
The one that you just passed with fully lit lights?
Yeah, I saw it.
Okay. You gotta move over into lane 2. Into lane 1, okay? You gotta give him a lane.
Oh.
Okay?
Okay.
Failure to move over is a $500 fine.
Oh.
Okay, for a emergency vehicle. Alright?
I see.
Alright, do you have a driver's license on you?
Yeah.
Awesome. Where are you guys heading?
We're heading to Dresden, but I'm...
Dresden?
Yeah.
What is in Dresden?
Well, Dresden is where black people couldn't go to...
Where, sorry?
Dresden is a place where black people couldn't go to the restaurant at some point, and we're making a movie about that.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
In Dresden, eh?
Yeah.
Small town.
Small town, yeah.
And who's gonna...
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks, and Frederick Douglass are among the prominent figures that come to mind when we think about the civil rights movement. But those leaders tell the American story. Canada's civil rights struggles are largely unknown. Slavery, segregation, and legislated racism are considered American shames. To this day, a myth prevails that Canada has always been a land of tolerance and equality. But if you dig deep enough, you'll find a different story.
Turn left onto Uncle Tom's Road.
In 1949, Dresden made national news when Maclean's magazine published an article by Sidney Katz in which he exposed the severe racial segregation taking place in a small southwestern town in Ontario.
Nope, we don't let Negroes in. Never have, never will. They have a place of their own.
There's little difference between the health and cleanliness of whites and colored in the Dresden area.
When colored women ask for an appointment, I sometimes tell them that I don't have the special equipment for crinkly hair.
Yet, in the 1800s, Dresden was an important terminus of the Underground Railroad, which brought thousands of fugitive black slaves from the US to Canada. The most famous of them was Josiah Henson, who inspired Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. But if the brave black women and men who fled the US found a certain freedom in Canada, their descendants in Dresden were certainly not free from the most overt form of racial discrimination more than 100 years later.
My colored patients, they are appreciative, friendly, honest, and clean.
You know what they're aiming at. They want to marry white women. That's the main reason they're agitating for rights, and that's why I'm against giving way to them.
Funny about this, I didn't know what was happening in Dresden before I went there. I was invited to go to Dresden with Dr. Daniel Hill, who went to speak to the organization in Dresden.
What was unique about Dresden was how absolute that segregation, that discrimination was. In Windsor, there was discrimination against black people. In Toronto, there was some discrimination. Certainly in Chatham, there was a lot of discrimination against black people. But in Dresden, the degree of it was greater. Hugh Burnett was born in 1914 in Dresden. In 1943, wearing his army uniform, he called it the King's uniform. Wearing the King's uniform, he went into a restaurant which he knew was discriminatory, did not serve black people. He expected to be served because he was wearing the uniform. He was serving his country, serving the king. But he was rejected. He was refused service in the restaurant. And so he wrote a letter to Louis Saint Laurent, who at the time was the Minister of Justice. He was later Prime Minister of Canada. Louis Saint Laurent did not answer the letter, but his deputy minister did. And he wrote back and he said to Hugh Burnett, maybe it's too bad, but there's nothing we can do about it. It's not against the law to discriminate. At that moment, he decided that when the war ended, he was going to do something about discrimination in his hometown.
Hugh Burnett and other Dresden area blacks formed the National Unity Association to combat discrimination in their town. And when they lobbied the mayor to pass anti-discrimination bylaws, the municipal council decided to put the question to the people of Dresden.
They said, this is too big a question for a city council to decide. So they decided to put it to a vote. The referendum lost by a ratio of about 5-1. That happens to be the ratio of white to black in Dresden at that time. Now, it was a secret ballot. I don't know how the vote went. Nobody knows how that vote went. But you have some clues, don't you? That probably virtually all the white people voted against and virtually all the black people voted in favor.
After the defeat at the municipal level, the National Unity Association took its cause to the province. Along with the Association for Civil Liberties, the Canadian Jewish Congress, and the Toronto Joint Labour Committee for Human Rights, they would launch an aggressive campaign to demand an anti-discrimination law in Ontario.
They decided to go back to the Premier and ask for a Fair Accommodations Practices Act. Nothing happened. The Premier didn't respond. So this campaign picked up speed with radio shots, with letters to the editor, with op-ed pieces in the newspapers, not just the Star and the Telly and the Globe, but the local newspapers and so on, where they were exhibiting this, demonstrating the existence of discrimination and saying that the only way to handle this is to bring in a law to change it. Because of this public outcry, the Premier decided that he better do something. So he called the Association for Civil Liberties, was the main group that was making the proposal. He called upon the association to meet him with a delegation to explain what they wanted in fair accommodations practices. When they got to the office in Queen's Park, they discovered the entire cabinet was lined up to hear them. Premier Frost was reported as saying that the speech by Hugh Burnett was the one that moved him most. 5 days later, a bill was introduced. The reason what made him change his mind was the public outcry. And what prompted the public outcry was the activities of the Jewish Labour Committee, the Toronto Labour Committee for Human Rights, through the organized labour movement out of Toronto, to publicize this and to convince people that they had to get active. Don't just sit at home saying it's terrible, write a letter to the Premier. And that's why we got fair accommodations practices in 1954.
The Fair Accommodation Practices Act of 1954 made it illegal for any businesses in Ontario to refuse services to anyone on the basis of the color of their skin. But in Dresden, places like Case Cafe and Emerson Restaurant chose to ignore the new provincial law. And when the Ministry of Labour refused to reinforce the law, Hugh Burnett turned to his allies in the labour movement to conduct a number of tests to prove to the government that not much has changed in Dresden.
Labour Council, through the executive director at that time, whose name was Sid Bloom, who came from the US, from New York, asked if I would go to Dresden to do a test.
Okay, so I went to meet Sid Bloom and asked him what was going on in Canada. He told me about Dresden and he asked me to take part.
Ruth Law, myself, Sid Bloom, a freelance reporter whose name was Gord Donaldson.
He and Sid went as control group, and then we also had two other reporters from the Star.
Ruth and I were the two who walked in, and we were sitting in the booth, and nobody did anything.
We sat there for about 20 minutes, and we were not served.
I got up and I went over to the waitress, and I spoke with her, and I said, "Good afternoon. I've just traveled all the way from Toronto, and I'd like to have something to eat and drink." And she made no sound, no nothing, no motion, no nothing. She was like a mannequin just looking at me. So I said, "Well, is there a manager or the owner? Could I see him or her?" And she started to use her eyelashes and flicked as if she was to the back. So I went to the back, and there's this man with a big paunch on him and a white apron with a meat cleaver in his hand, chopping on a block, chopping quietly, just moving it back and forth. And I said, "Good afternoon, sir. You are the manager?" Chop, chop, chop. I've just traveled from Toronto and we're very hungry. I'd like to have something to eat. chop, chop, chop. And the more I talked to him, the chopping got a little bit faster. But I was looking at him in his face, and I could see his countenance changing. You could see the anger developing in him. And I finally said to myself, maybe this is enough. You better not take a chance that guy is going to throw that meat cleaver at you, because I'd be dead. So I decided to go back to the seat. I went back, and they were sitting, the reporter, Hugh Burnett, and Sid Bloom, and the photographer. So they asked, "Did you guys get served?" No service, nothing. So they said to the photographer, "Go out and bring your camera in and take pictures of their table, and come in and take pictures of the table." And they came in 20 minutes after we did. And they were served, no problem. And when the proprietor found out that this were testing him, getting evidence against what was going on, he came from the back in a hurry with his white apron, same way, walked to the door, bolted the door, and put off the lights and pulled the Venetian blinds. We're all inside. We had all the evidence already now anyway, so we're going to leave from there to go to Emerson, which is a restaurant up the street that is part of this whole affair.
The following day, the Dresden story made the headlines of all the major papers in Toronto. In his column, Gordon Donaldson, the Telegram reporter who also went to Dresden, emphasized the Minister of Labor's continued inaction.
The Minister of Labor, a man called Daly, refused to prosecute. The Premier, who was Leslie Frost at the time, finally spoke up and said in the legislature, "I stand by my legislation. And I want to say, as long as I'm Premier of this province, we will have no second-class citizens." And we finally got a conviction on our case, Ruth Law and I. And the case was appealed.
They had a lawyer that was argued that the Fair Accommodations Practices Act that had been passed by the Ontario government was not legal. They argued that it was a criminal case and therefore should have been passed by the Canadian government.
It went before the Appeals Court of Ontario, and the judge threw our case out, saying there's no discrimination. They just didn't tell us when they were going to serve us. I guess we didn't stay long enough. We might have been there for 10 years waiting.
And then we had to do it again. I mean, we had to organize a second test case.
Two other young fellows from Trinidad, who were students at the University of Toronto, followed our case, did the testing all over. The case went before the courts, and they got a conviction again. The case was appealed. This time, the judge promptly told them, there is a law, the Ontario Fair Accommodation Practices Act. You have contravened that act, and you're guilty of discrimination.